Deadly Blessing wasn't just a rural horror story, it was a quiet spiritual detonation wrapped inside a farmhouse, the kind of film that seemed convinced something unseen was already watching. Wes Craven stepped into the project at a moment when his career was still searching for shape, only to find himself navigating a community plagued by superstition, studio hesitation, and a script that felt cursed even before cameras rolled. Actors clashed with the suffocating atmosphere, scenes were rewritten under pressure, and the production kept brushing up against a religious world it barely understood. Why would Craven push forward when every sign warned him to stop? Why did this forgotten film leave behind one of the most disturbing images in horror history? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about Deadly Blessing. Fact 1. The strange tension that hovered over Deadly Blessing began long before the first slate clapped. Rooted in a script that Wes Craven felt both drawn to and unsettled by, he was fascinated by the idea of an isolated religious sect. Yet he sensed that the story's darkness came from something older than fiction. During pre-production, Craven visited rural communities to observe how closed belief systems shaped behavior. What he found was not hostility, but silence, an eerie, watchful quiet that made him question whether the film's supernatural elements were metaphor or mirror. Crew members later said Craven returned from these trips changed, insisting the film should feel spiritually oppressive rather than traditionally frightening. This philosophy pushed the art department to strip away color, the cinematographer to favor long, suffocating frames, and the actors to underplay their reactions until fear felt internal rather than theatrical. Yet the deeper Craven leaned into authenticity, the more resistance he met from producers who worried the project was drifting into territory too strange for mainstream audiences. That friction never fully disappeared, shadowing every creative decision and creating an atmosphere where no one knew if the film was horror, drama, or a psychological experiment disguised as one. In the end, the unease became part of the film's identity, as if the production itself had been absorbed into the story it was trying to tell. Fact 2. Long before Sharon Stone became a recognizable name, Deadly Blessing placed her in a role that demanded far more psychological vulnerability than most early career actors were prepared for. She was eager, ambitious, and determined to make a strong impression, but the set offered little comfort. Craven believed her character needed to radiate both innocence and suppressed fear, so he pushed her towards subtle, trembling performances rather than loud emotional displays. Stone later admitted she often felt adrift, unsure whether she was delivering what Craven wanted or simply exposing her own anxieties. The isolation of the rural location only deepened that uncertainty. Cast and crew stayed in scattered lodgings, meals were quiet, and rehearsals sometimes took place outdoors at dusk, where the fading light blurred the line between rehearsal and hallucination. Several actors recalled Stone wandering off between takes to reset her breathing, whispering lines to herself as though the character had followed her off camera. What made the experience more intense was the looming presence of the film's religious antagonists, whose controlled, emotionless deliveries created an oppressive tone. Stone's instinct was to push against that stillness, but Craven repeatedly told her to stay fragile, a direction that left her suspended in a state of constant tension. By the time the camera stopped rolling, she had delivered a performance far more delicate and raw than audiences would realize, a glimpse of the intensity she would later become famous for. Fact 3. The production's most unsettling moments often came from the landscape itself. As if the film's rural setting refused to behave like a neutral backdrop, Wes Craven selected remote farmland to capture the claustrophobia of a community cut off from the world, but the location introduced complications that no one anticipated. Machinery malfunctioned without explanation. Lights blew during calm weather, animals wandered into frame even when none had been spotted nearby moments earlier. Crew members joked that the land didn't want to be filmed, but the repetition of these incidents began to wear down their humor. The most persistent issue was the fog. It rolled in at unpredictable hours, thick and unnatural, forcing entire scenes to be rewritten or postponed. Craven eventually leaned into this unpredictability, allowing the fog to shape the film's visual personality, but the constant recalibration strained the schedule and frayed tempers. Actors found themselves performing emotionally heavy scenes after hours of waiting in silence, their nerves thin and attention fragmented. Even the producers, usually distant from the creative grind, started appearing on set, anxious about time slipping away. What lingered most, though, were the moments when everyone felt watched. Crew members claimed they sensed movement in the fields when nothing was visible, heard distant footsteps that left no tracks, or glimpsed shapes disappearing behind trees. Whether imagination or instinct, the land's strange mood seeped into the film, becoming a character of its own. Fact 4. From the beginning, Deadly Blessing faced a creative tug-of-war between Wes Craven and the studio, a clash that shaped nearly every scene that ended up on screen. Craven envisioned a slow, suffocating psychological horror built on atmosphere and spiritual dread, but the producers wanted something sharper, louder, and easier to market. Notes arrived almost daily, demanding more action, more conventional scares, and quicker pacing, leaving Craven feeling as though the film he was making kept dissolving beneath his feet. At one point, a full sequence was rewritten overnight because executives worried audiences wouldn't understand the silence. Craven resisted, arguing that silence was the film's real antagonist, the thing that made the community's beliefs feel dangerous rather than theatrical. Tensions escalated when the studio hired additional editors to recut early footage without Craven's approval, resulting in scenes that no longer resembled his psychological blueprint. Cast members recalled walking onto set, unsure whether they were filming Craven's version of the story or the studio's compromise. Even the ending became a battlefield, with debates about whether to lean into theology, superstition, or pure shock. In the end, the finished film became a hybrid, part Craven's meditation on fear, part studio-driven spectacle, and that uneasy marriage left behind a strange legacy. A horror film that feels like two visions whispering at once, never fully merging, never fully separating. Fact 5. The film's makeup and prosthetic team found themselves navigating challenges far more technical and far more unnerving than they expected for a story built on spiritual tension rather than monsters. Craven wanted the characters to appear worn down by belief, as though doctrine had marked their skin the way weather marks a cliff face. To achieve this, the team used subtle shading techniques that exaggerated tension lines, created micro-sweat patterns under hot lights, and added barely visible patches of uneven texture to suggest long-term stress. But the real challenge emerged during the film's more surreal moments, where Craven requested effects that felt natural yet impossible. One sequence required makeup to degrade slowly during a take, fading like breath on glass, forcing the crew to design pigments that reacted to body heat instead of light. Another involved a prosthetic application so delicate that a full hour of setup could be undone by a single facial twitch. Actors described the process as both fascinating and claustrophobic, with long stretches spent in silence while makeup artists adjusted tiny imperfections that would barely register on camera, but mattered enormously to Craven's vision. The studio, however, questioned whether such painstaking detail was worth the time, pressuring the effects team to work faster. Their refusal created small rebellions within the schedule, where craft was chosen over efficiency. Those choices weren't always visible to audiences, but they shaped the film's eerie realism, embedding tension directly into the actor's skin. Fact 6. Sound design became one of the film's most quietly radical elements. Though few viewers recognized how deeply it influenced the mood, Craven believed horror didn't need orchestral stabs or loud cues. Instead, he wanted sound to feel like an invisible character that lingered just outside the frame. To accomplish this, the audio team recorded natural noises from the farmland at different times of day, capturing faint movements that didn't match the environment on screen, footsteps that echoed without direction, birdsong that seemed a little too distant, wind that carried a rhythm instead of a tone. Each layer was arranged to create a sense of presence rather than atmosphere. During test screenings, viewers couldn't articulate why certain scenes felt unnerving, only that they sensed something wrong with the space. The studio pushed for a more traditional horror score, but Craven protected the soundscape fiercely, insisting that terror worked best when it didn't announce itself. He even removed early musical cues that hinted too strongly at danger, replacing them with moments of near silence where the only audible element was a faint, inexplicable rustle. The result was a film in which fear doesn't leap forward. It creeps in quietly, as if listening for the audience instead of the other way around. Fact 7. The production's growing tension manifested most clearly in the way cast members described their dreams during filming, a detail that became an unexpected part of the film's mythology. Nearly everyone involved reported vivid, unsettling nightmares that began shortly after shooting started. Some dreamed of empty fields stretching endlessly behind the farmhouse. Others described faceless figures watching them from doorways or standing silently at the edge of their motel parking lots. Sharon Stone admitted she woke several nights in a row, convinced someone had touched her shoulder, only to find the room empty. Craven didn't dismiss these stories. Instead, he encouraged the actors to treat the dreams as extensions of the film's psychological terrain. He believed the script's themes of spiritual oppression had seeped into their subconscious, creating a feedback loop between art and experience. The studio, worried the cast might become too unsettled, hired a local counselor to check in periodically, though most actors declined the offer. Even crew members who considered themselves skeptics acknowledged a strange shift in mood after dark. Equipment left overnight sometimes appeared slightly displaced in the morning, though no one could explain how. Flashlights flickered during late setups, not from battery failure, but as if responding to movement. These minor disturbances accumulated until the crew adopted a quiet ritual of speaking softly in the main farmhouse set, as though afraid to wake something sleeping in the walls. Whether psychological contagion or environmental influence, the dreams became a shared language, an invisible script running beneath the one they were filming, and that collective unease now echoes through every frame of the finished movie. Fact 8. One of the film's most demanding sequences involved an attempt to stage a baptism scene that would feel both ritualistic and unnervingly intimate, reflecting the community's suffocating beliefs rather than any recognizable religious practice. Craven wanted it to play like a moment of spiritual weight bearing down on a reluctant participant, so he rehearsed the scene extensively with the actors before cameras rolled. The water's temperature had to be lowered to create visible breath in the air, a detail that required filming at night under minimal lighting. Actors struggled to maintain composure as their bodies reacted to the cold, which heightened the tension Craven sought, but posed real physical strain. The production's safety officer raised concerns about repeated immersions, suggesting shorter takes, but Craven argued continuity was essential to preserve the ritual's psychological impact. The studio reluctantly agreed, though they insisted on additional health monitoring. Even then, unexpected problems emerged. The water trough absorbed heat too quickly, forcing the crew to repeatedly chill it with ice between takes, delaying the schedule and exhausting everyone involved. The lead actor later described the scene as emotionally suffocating, noting that the combination of cold, darkness, and ritual choreography created a moment that felt less like acting and more like surrender. In post-production, editors softened the sequence to meet rating concerns, but traces of its original intensity remain an echo of a scene that pushed performers to the threshold of their endurance. Fact 9. The farmhouse, the central location for much of the film, carried its own secrets that shaped the production in ways no one anticipated. Originally built as a functional home decades earlier, it had been abandoned for years before the crew arrived. Scouting notes described it as structurally sound but emotionally heavy, a phrase that puzzled the producers until they walked inside. Rooms felt colder than the air outside. Even in summer, doors drifted open without drafts, and the upstairs hallway held a persistent odor of dust and something faintly metallic, which no amount of cleaning eliminated. During the first week of shooting, electrical systems failed repeatedly. Though the wiring tested normal each time, crew members blamed faulty breakers, but the problems always resurfaced in the same rooms, as if the house resisted being illuminated. Craven, instead of being frustrated, embraced the building's temperament, instructing the cinematographer to use natural shadows whenever possible, but actors found the space overwhelming. One refused to wait alone in the upstairs bedroom between setups, claiming she heard someone breathing behind her even when the room was empty. Another reported seeing a figure reflected in a window that vanished when he turned. The production never documented these encounters officially, but stories circulated quietly, feeding the belief that the house itself was participating in the film. When shooting wrapped, the crew dismantled equipment quickly, relieved to leave. Yet several later admitted they felt the house wasn't done with them. It had simply watched them finish. Fact 10. Sharon Stone's earliest days on set revealed a performer caught between raw instinct and the intimidating expectations of a director still sharpening his identity. Craven saw promise in her intensity, but he also sensed an unpredictability he wanted to nurture rather than restrain. He encouraged her to approach scenes with emotional restraint, letting fear simmer beneath the surface instead of erupting. Stone, however, was still learning how to calibrate subtlety for the camera, often questioning whether her choices were visible or disappearing into the film's muted palette. That uncertainty grew heavier when she discovered how physically demanding some sequences would be. Rural heat made interior sets stifling, while night shoots forced her to deliver intricate emotional beats while shivering between takes. Castmates noticed she would isolate herself before scenes, repeating lines in a whisper as though searching for the exact fracture point where her character's poise would break. Craven asked her to maintain a constant sense of internal tremor, a direction that left her hovering between exhaustion and heightened alertness. Stone later admitted the role felt like an initiation into a world she didn't yet understand, the kind where fear wasn't performed but mined from genuine vulnerability. The experience demanded more from her than anyone realized, pushing her into a psychological tension that laid groundwork for the commanding presence she would eventually develop. And although Deadly Blessing didn't announce her arrival to the world, it marked the first time she sensed that her fear, when controlled, could be a cinematic asset rather than a weakness. Fact 11. The film's most infamous sequence, the spider crawling into Sharon Stone's mouth, originated from a combination of necessity, improvisation, and Craven's relentless pursuit of visceral realism. Early drafts featured a symbolic nightmare rather than a literal arachnid encounter, but Craven felt the story needed a moment where psychological dread collided with physical violation. A mechanical spider was tested first, but its movement looked artificial under close-up lenses, breaking the illusion. Craven then proposed using a real tarantula, a suggestion that unsettled both cast and crew. Stone wasn't officially required to perform the stunt, yet she understood the impact it could deliver. After long discussions and assurances from handlers, she agreed with strict limits on duration and safety measures. The tarantula was trained to move toward warm surfaces, meaning Stone had to control her breathing to guide its path without startling it. The room fell silent during the take, every crew member frozen as the spider crawled across her face and toward her lips. Stone later described the moment as a battle between instinct and professionalism, her mind screaming while her body remained still. The first successful take left the set shaken. Even veteran crew members admitted they had never witnessed such commitment from an emerging actress. That decision cemented the scene as one of the most disturbing in Craven's catalog. A fusion of performer bravery and directorial audacity, and its power endures precisely because it wasn't trickery. It was a moment where fear became real. Fact 12. Behind the tension of the film's religious imagery lay a deeper conflict: how to portray a closed extremist community without reducing it to caricature. Craven, who grew up within a strict religious environment, wanted the sect to feel authentic rather than sensationalized. He spent weeks researching fringe belief systems, studying how isolation shapes doctrine and how doctrine shapes behavior. The challenge was translating this into performances that felt lived in rather than theatrical. Actors portraying sect members were instructed to maintain emotional restraint, avoiding obvious expressions of anger or zeal. Craven believed true conviction was quiet, not loud, a pressure that suffocates rather than explodes. This approach required them to rehearse with minimal movement, speaking lines in near whispers to build a sense of controlled menace. Costume designers reinforced the effect with rigid fabrics that restricted motion, creating physical tension that mirrored psychological rigidity. Yet the studio worried the characters seemed too subdued, pushing for more overt hostility. Craven resisted, arguing that the fear of the sect came from its calm certainty, not its volume. On set, this philosophy created an atmosphere that felt strange even to the actors. They often stayed in character between takes, speaking sparingly and keeping their distance from the rest of the cast. Sharon Stone recalled feeling genuinely unsettled whenever she had to interact with them, describing their collective stillness as a wall you couldn't see through. The result was a portrayal that avoided stereotype, grounding the film's spiritual dread in a realism that lingers long after the closing credits. Fact 13. The film's most visually unsettling moments came from Craven's insistence on grounding surreal imagery in tactile realism, a choice that pushed his team toward techniques that blurred the line between dream logic and physical presence. One of the most complex sequences involved a character encountering an unseen force that seemed to bend the space around her. Craven didn't want conventional visual effects, which he felt would age poorly. Instead, he asked the crew to manipulate the environment in ways that felt subtly wrong. Set walls were built with hidden hinges, allowing them to shift by millimeters during the scene, creating the illusion that the room itself was breathing. Props were weighted on one side so they would settle at imperceptible angles, the kind that register subconsciously rather than visually. Even lighting rigs were adjusted to introduce slow oscillations, causing shadows to lengthen or shrink without a clear source. Actors found performing under these conditions disorienting, unsure whether their reactions should reflect fear or confusion. Craven encouraged the uncertainty, believing authentic unease would emerge from the performers' attempts to decode their surroundings. But the method wasn't without risk. At one point, a wall panel swung too far and nearly struck a camera operator, prompting temporary safety restrictions and a tense conversation with producers who questioned the necessity of such elaborate setups. Craven defended the approach, arguing that the audience needed to feel destabilized, not through spectacle, but through the quiet realization that ordinary objects had turned against their purpose. The resulting sequence carries an eeriness impossible to replicate through post-production. Its power lies in the fact that the world appears unchanged, yet undeniably hostile, as though the film itself is whispering that something has slipped out of place. Fact 14. The bathtub scene, one of Deadly Blessing's most enduring images, originated from a moment of creative frustration rather than deliberate design. Craven struggled to craft a set piece that captured the film's central theme, vulnerability within a space that should feel safe. After rejecting several early concepts as too predictable, he began exploring the idea of water as a threshold, something that both conceals and exposes. The notion of an unseen presence rising beneath the surface emerged from there, but executing it required significant technical experimentation. The crew constructed a two-layer tub, the upper portion where the actress performed, and a hidden chamber beneath where the stunt performer controlling the emerging presence would maneuver. This design allowed for a seamless intrusion into the frame, but it also meant the water had to remain perfectly still until the exact moment of disruption. Any tremor, even from breathing, could ruin the illusion. The actress endured long stretches of stillness, holding poses that grew increasingly uncomfortable under hot lights. Meanwhile, the stunt performer operated blind, guided only by hand signals and rehearsed timing. Safety concerns intensified when the tub's mechanism jammed mid-rehearsal, briefly trapping the stunt performer before crew members intervened. Despite the setback, Craven pushed forward, convinced the scene's emotional weight justified the complexity. The final take required near-silent coordination among every department, a choreography as tense as the moment it produced, and although later horror films would echo the image, none fully matched the raw intrusion captured here, a moment where serenity fractures into terror without warning. Fact 15. The editing process for Deadly Blessing revealed just how much the film depended on rhythm rather than shock, a distinction that set Craven apart from many contemporaries. Early assembly cuts ran long, filled with lingering shots Craven hoped would evoke mounting dread, but the studio worried the pacing was too deliberate. Pushing for a more conventional structure with quicker cuts and clearer narrative beats, editors found themselves navigating between two conflicting philosophies: Craven's preference for slow, atmospheric tension and the studio's demand for urgency. The compromise required a meticulous reconsideration of how scenes transitioned, particularly moments involving the religious sect. Craven believed their presence should feel like a tide advancing quietly until suddenly overwhelming, so he instructed the editors to hold on reaction shots a fraction longer than comfortable, letting silence do the work. The studio, by contrast, pushed for explanatory inserts and dialogue trims that made motivations more explicit. Several heated discussions followed, culminating in a hybrid approach where Craven was allowed to preserve the film's most lingering moments while ceding control over certain narrative clarifications. One notable debate centered on the placement of a key reveal. Craven preferred to bury it within atmosphere, while the studio insisted on foregrounding it. The final version splits the difference, offering clarity without sacrificing mood. What emerged from the editing room was a film defined by friction, a tension between vision and expectation that ultimately enhanced its unsettling tone. The cuts don't simply guide the story, they create an emotional stutter, a sense that the film is withholding something just beyond understanding. Fact 16. The uneasy tone of Deadly Blessing was intensified by a recurring issue the crew could never fully explain. The film stock behaved unpredictably, producing faint distortions that appeared only after processing. Cinematographers initially blamed humidity, believing the rural environment was affecting the reels, but tests showed the equipment was functioning normally. The distortions were subtle, brief flickers, a soft haze at the edge of the frame, or shadows that seemed to thicken for a fraction of a second, but they appeared frequently enough to unsettle the post-production team. Craven, instead of rejecting the anomalies, explored whether they could serve the film's atmosphere. He requested comparisons between clean and affected footage, intrigued by how the imperfections added a sense of instability, as though the film itself were absorbing the oppressive beliefs of the narrative. Producers, however, were alarmed. They feared audiences would assume technical incompetence, not artistic intent, and urged Craven to reshoot several scenes. Reshoots were impossible due to both budget and scheduling limits, so the team debated how aggressively to correct the distortions. Ultimately, Craven made a controversial decision: leave many of them intact. In his view, the imperfections mirrored the story's psychological fractures, enhancing the feeling that reality within the film was slightly misaligned. Editors worked to integrate the anomalies seamlessly, crafting transitions that embraced the texture rather than masking it. Even though viewers rarely notice these artifacts consciously, their presence contributes to the movie's pervasive discomfort. And perhaps fittingly, the exact cause of the distortions was never conclusively identified, becoming yet another mystery stitched into the film's DNA. Fact 17. The score for Deadly Blessing emerged from a creative partnership defined by both harmony and quiet disagreement, as composer James Horner, still early in his career, sought to shape a soundscape that balanced spiritual solemnity with mounting dread. Horner envisioned a palette built on soft choral textures, restrained strings, and tones that felt more devotional than horrific. Craven admired the ambition but worried the approach softened the film's sharper edges. Their collaboration unfolded through long sessions in which they debated the emotional temperature of each scene, arguing not over melody but over meaning. Horner believed fear could be suggested through suggestion and contrast, while Craven leaned towards silence and environmental sound. This philosophical divide pushed Horner into experimentation, blending traditional orchestration with unusual timbres, created by bowing metal objects or manipulating breathy vocals into ghost-like harmonics. Several cues were rejected for being too beautiful, a critique Horner accepted reluctantly, recognizing that the film demanded emotional abrasion rather than elegance. The final score reflects a delicate balance, sparse in many moments, intrusive in others, always searching for the unseen forces shaping the characters' lives. Although Horner would later become known for sweeping, emotive compositions, traces of his early experimentation linger here. It is a rare glimpse of a future master wrestling with the boundaries of horror, attempting to carve out a musical identity within a story that resisted easy interpretation, and in those tensions between beauty and dread lies the quiet pulse that keeps the film unnervingly alive. Fact 18. One of the film's lasting contributions to Craven's career emerged not from its scares, but from the questions it forced him to confront about identity, belief, and the shape of fear. Deadly Blessing sits at an intersection in his filmography, bridging the raw aggression of his earlier work with the psychological nuance that would later define films like A Nightmare on Elm Street. Craven often spoke about how the project challenged him to think beyond shock, urging him to consider how faith, twisted or sincere, could become a vessel for terror. The experience pushed him to refine his understanding of character-driven horror, focusing not just on what frightened people but why those fears took root. Conversations with cast members deepened this shift, as many shared personal experiences with restrictive belief systems or insular communities. Craven absorbed these stories, shaping them into a broader meditation on control, vulnerability, and the invisible mechanisms through which people surrender power. Though Deadly Blessing received mixed reactions upon release, it planted the seeds for thematic obsessions that would define Craven's most iconic work: the invasion of dreams, the fragility of perception, and the idea that humans often fear the structures meant to protect them. Looking back, Craven described the film as a turning point, a lesson in how horror could interrogate the soul as fiercely as it assaulted the senses. And in that transformation lies the film's quiet legacy, a catalyst that redirected one of horror's most influential voices. Fact 19. The film's final act underwent one of the most contentious evolutions in its development, shaped by competing pressures from Craven, the studio, and a test audience that reacted unpredictably to early cuts. Craven originally conceived an ending rooted in psychological ambiguity, where the forces tormenting the characters might be read as either supernatural or manifestations of communal paranoia. The studio, however, pushed for something more definitive, an explicit confrontation that could anchor the film within a recognizable horror framework. Early test screenings complicated matters further. Viewers were divided, with some praising the ambiguity as haunting, while others found it frustrating. As a result, the editing room became a battleground of hypotheses. Craven experimented with multiple versions of the climax, adjusting the pacing, reordering shots, and even reconsidering whether the film should end at a moment of quiet dread or escalate into shock. The debate intensified when executives proposed a more explosive finale. Citing commercial expectations, Craven reluctantly filmed additional inserts to satisfy these demands, though he worried the additions contradicted the film's internal logic. Ultimately, the final cut blended both impulses, Craven's atmospheric tension and the studio's desire for a striking reveal. The hybrid ending, though controversial, generated the film's most talked-about moment, one that critics later argued felt both out of place and strangely inevitable. What remains clear is that the ending represents the entire production in miniature, a negotiation between vision and market pressure, leaving behind a conclusion that unsettles precisely because it refuses to choose a single truth. Fact 20. Long after filming wrapped, Deadly Blessing developed a reputation for harboring secrets that its creators never fully addressed, particularly regarding script drafts that hinted at deeper mythologies. Early versions of the screenplay included detailed histories of the religious sect, exploring how its doctrines evolved and why certain rituals carried such oppressive weight. These passages were eventually removed to streamline pacing, but fragments survived in scattered lines and brief visual cues. Cast members recalled Craven referencing ideas from these abandoned drafts during rehearsals, stories of internal schisms, forbidden texts, and symbolic gestures that never appear explicitly in the final film. This created a layered ambiguity. Actors often played motivations rooted in histories the audience would never see. Some felt empowered by the hidden lore, others found it disorienting. Unsure how much of their character's behavior should be visible on screen, Craven defended the decision to leave the mythology understated, believing fear grew stronger when the audience sensed a system too vast to fully grasp. Scholars later revisiting the film noted that this narrative incompleteness contributed to its enduring fascination. The gaps invite interpretation, prompting viewers to project their own fears onto the unspoken spaces, and while the missing material remains locked in drafts and marginal notes, its ghostly presence shapes the film's tone, a reminder that Deadly Blessing was built on a world larger than the one it revealed. Bonus fact: the most haunting legacy of Deadly Blessing emerged not from its script, performances, or production tensions, but from a quiet moment that unfolded after filming ended, an incident whispered among crew members and never formally documented. Weeks after the final wrap, a small team returned to the farmhouse location to retrieve leftover equipment and close out property agreements. The house, long abandoned before production and stripped nearly bare by the crew, should have felt empty. Instead, the returning team reported an atmosphere heavier than during the shoot itself, as if the structure resented being left behind. While cataloging items in the main bedroom, one crew member noticed faint markings on the wall lines arranged in patterns that resembled the symbols. Developed for the film's fictional sect, the production designer insisted no such symbols had been painted or etched during filming, and photographs taken before the shoot confirmed the walls were unmarked, yet the patterns remained, subtle but unmistakable, as though they had surfaced from beneath the paint rather than being added afterward. Attempts to scrub the markings only made them appear clearer, darkening like damp ink rising through paper. The property owner, asked about the discoloration, dismissed it as residue from moisture, though the patterns bore intentional symmetry. The crew left unsettled, sensing they had disturbed something that preferred obscurity. Craven, informed of the incident later, offered no interpretation. He simply listened, then remarked that stories become myths not because they are verified, but because they refuse to dissolve. Whether coincidence, illusion, or something deeper embedded within the house's history, the markings became an unspoken epilogue to the production, a final reminder that the boundary between invention and intrusion is thinner than filmmakers often admit. And in that lingering silence, Deadly Blessing found the last of its secrets, one not crafted for the screen, but inherited from a place that had been watching all along. Deadly Blessing endures because it never settles into a single shape. It wavers between psychological unease and spiritual terror, carrying the residue of a production that seemed constantly on the edge of revealing something it couldn't fully articulate. Craven's evolving instincts, the cast's raw vulnerability, and the land's strange temperament fused into a film that resists clarity even 8 decades later. Its mysteries linger, not because they were crafted to confuse, but because the story itself seems to breathe quietly, steadily, long after the final frame. If one of these hidden truths shifted your understanding of the film, tell us which detail stayed with you the longest, and whether you think its most uncanny moments were accidents or design. And as always, let us know what strange piece of cinema you want us to uncover next.